Dante Wallace stood in front of the towering glass building, his breath catching slightly as sunlight bounced off the panels above. Blackstone Innovations shimmered in bold silver letters, the kind of company name that held weight in the tech world. To others walking past, it might have been just another office tower. To Dante, it was everything he'd worked for. Every late-night coding in his dorm room, every scholarship he fought to win, every time he was told someone like him wouldn't make it in this world. And now, here he was. Atlanta, downtown, his name on the dotted line. Lead project manager at one of the top AI firms in the South. He adjusted his tie, navy blue, his mother's favorite color. He'd kept it simple, crisp shirt, clean-shaven. Nothing too flashy. Everything about him that day was deliberate. He had learned long ago that black excellence wasn't enough. It had to be immaculate. Dante's story didn't begin with high-rises or suits. It began in a cramped two-bedroom apartment on the west side of Atlanta, a neighborhood the city forgot but the people within never did. Cracked sidewalks, underfunded, schools and liquor stores on every corner. But it was also a place where block parties echoed with music, and neighbors became family. His mother, Sandra Wallace, had raised him and his younger sister, Tiana, on grit and prayer alone. She cleaned office buildings during the day and waited tables at night. She used to say, "You don't have to be from somewhere shiny to shine, baby." It was her dream he carried as he stepped through the glass doors. The lobby was pristine, cool marble floors, minimalist decor, and the scent of money. Not the loud kind, but the kind that whispers, the kind that had generational depth. A white receptionist glanced up from behind the sleek curved desk, her smile practiced and tight. "Can I help you?" she asked, eyeing him briefly before her gaze flicked to the door behind him, almost as if expecting someone else to follow. "I'm Dante Wallace. Today's my first day," he said calmly, offering the warmest version of his voice. He was used to softening his tone in unfamiliar white spaces. Her eyes paused on his face longer. This time, something flickered. Surprise, doubt, it passed in a blink. "Oh," she said, tapping at her screen. "Okay. Wallace, right, have a seat. Someone from HR will come get you." Dante nodded and took a seat by the window. As he sat, he caught a glimpse of himself in the glass. He straightened his posture. First impressions. Always. He remembered the long path that got him here. Community college, a transfer to Georgia Tech, internships no one thought he'd land, late nights hacking solutions together with nothing but YouTube tutorials and a borrowed laptop. While others were discussing spring breaks, he was juggling classes and DoorDash deliveries. He never resented it. It just made the victory sharper. A man in a tailored gray suit walked by the lobby, glanced at Dante and offered a slight nod. Polite but distant. A second later, he turned back, brows furrowed. "You here for deliveries?" he asked. Dante blinked, then offered a small smile. "No, actually. I'm the new lead on Project Axiom." The man's face shifted, not embarrassment. "Just surprise," he chuckled. "Huh, didn't expect that. Good luck, good luck." It was always the same. A smile dipped in doubt. By the time HR arrived, Dante had already mapped the subtle cues of his new world. A world polished on the surface, but layered with quiet judgments and unspoken codes. He followed the HR rep, a young black woman named Keisha, through glass corridors and open-concept workspaces. She moved quickly, professionally, but shot him a glance and a half-smile in the elevator that said, "I see you." The executive floor felt colder. Quiet hums of machines and the occasional click of high-end shoes echoed in the hallway. Dante was introduced to his new team, mostly white, mostly male, a few offering tight handshakes and sideways glances. One of them, a man named Rick, barely looked up from his laptop before muttering, "Didn't know we were hiring out of community grants now." It wasn't loud, it wasn't even direct, but it was sharp enough. Dante heard it, and he stored. Still he focused. The project was revolutionary. AI-powered predictive learning for urban traffic systems, something Dante had been passionate about since college. The irony wasn't lost on him. A black man designing systems to improve the very roads his neighborhood lacked infrastructure for. That afternoon, in his office, a sleek corner cubicle with a partial view of the skyline, Dante opened his laptop and began reviewing code. For a moment he forgot the whispers, the tight smiles, the doubt. Here, in front of code, things made sense. Logic didn't care about skin color. But then Wade Hargrove entered. Wade was every bit the executive you'd expect. Charismatic, commanding, and curated. Late 40s, salt and pepper hair, tailored suits, and the air of someone who'd never been told no without an apology. "So you're Wallace," he said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Heard good things. Let's hope the hype checks out." It wasn't what he said. It was how he said it. The undercurrent. The unspoken. "Let's see if you belong." Dante extended his hand. Wade took it, firm grip, then turned to glance at his screen. "Working on Axiom already. Impressive. Just remember, we keep things sharp around here. Corporate sharp. Not urban sharp, if you catch my drift." And there it was, a flicker. A crack in the shine, the first bruise. Subtle enough to deny, sharp enough to wound. Dante didn't respond. Not right away. He held the moment, then smiled lightly. Understood. But inside, something shifted. This wasn't just about proving himself. This was about surviving it. And as the door closed behind Wade, Dante looked out the window again. The skyline hadn't changed, but something inside him had. Dante stood at the head of the long, polished mahogany table. The room was silent except for the low hum of the AC and the subtle clicks of pens being tapped against notepads. 12 people sat around him, VPs, department heads, and Wade Hargrove at the end, fingers steepled, eyes unreadable. Behind Dante, the projection screen showed his final slide, a dynamic model that used AI-driven algorithms to predict traffic density in underserved areas with 40% more accuracy than existing models. It wasn't just data. It was potential. Real change. Lives improved. Accidents avoided. Emergency routes optimized. He'd built it from the ground up, sleepless nights and endless trial runs until the system practically breathed on its own. He finished speaking. His voice, calm and assured, trailed off, with a clear call to action, then silence. One of the VPs shifted in his chair. Another scribbled something in a notebook. No nods, no eye contact, just cold, measured quiet. Then came a tepid clap, just one. From Keisha, sitting at the far end, watching nervously. It echoed like an apology. A moment later, Wade offered a dry smile. "Well," he said finally, "that was comprehensive. Comprehensive. Not excellent. Not groundbreaking. Just clinical praise wrapped in indifference." Rick, the same man who'd muttered about community grants last week, leaned forward. "Interesting framework," he said. "But have you considered simplifying it for real-time applications? So it doesn't get too ambitious." Dante kept his face still. The model was built for real-time applications. That was half the point. He had already detailed that in slide 5, which Rick clearly hadn't paid attention to. Another executive added, "Maybe we can have someone from engineering polish the concept. Package it better. Give it a bit more structure." Dante clenched his hands under the table. "The structure is already embedded," he replied evenly. "What's being shown here is the refined version. It's deployment ready." There was a brief pause. Wade smiled again. "Of course. We appreciate the initiative, Dante. Why don't you send the documentation to Rick's team for review? They'll work on getting it integrated into next month's rollout." That was it. The meeting moved on. Budget forecasts, hiring freezes, notes on the upcoming merger. Dante sat down slowly, his heart thudding, not from nerves, but from something colder, something heavier. 2 days later, the company-wide email went out. Blackstone announces breakthrough in predictive traffic AI, led by Rick Jensen's team. Dante read it twice, blinking at the subject line. The body praised Rick's strategic leadership and his team's innovative leap in modeling underserved routes. There was no mention of Dante, not in the byline, not in the footnotes. Nothing. It was as if he'd never stood in that room. As if the long nights in the lab, the hundreds of pages of code, the data trials, all of it had been erased. He walked straight to Wade's office. Knocked once. Inside, Wade sat behind his desk, skimming a report. He didn't look up. "Got a sec?" Dante asked. Wade gestured to the chair. "Always." Dante sat, posture firm but calm. "I noticed the rollout email. My name wasn't mentioned. I developed the model. Everything from the logic tree to the deployment layer. That was my work." Wade looked up now, his expression still pleasant. "Yes, we're all very proud of the work. And you're part of the team, Dante, but let's not get caught up in credit. This is about impact, not ego." Dante held his stare. "I'm not talking about ego. I'm talking about attribution." Wade chuckled, a smooth, practiced sound. "You've got good instincts, Dante, but you're new to leadership at this level. Trust me, it's not always wise to push too hard. For the spotlight, especially when you're still establishing your voice." Dante's stomach dropped. Wade stood, walked over to the window and stared out for a moment. Then, as if offhandedly, he said, "Look, some advice. Tone it down. We're a polished corporate environment, not a community workshop. You don't want to sound like urban trash in this setting." The words hit like glass shattering inside his chest. Urban trash. Dante didn't move, didn't blink. Time slowed. He had heard worse growing up. On the streets, in schoolyards, from patrol officers who searched him without reason. But this was different. This was a decorated man in a skyscraper, dressed in success, smiling while cutting deep. Wade turned back around, unfazed. "You're smart, but smart isn't enough. You have to fit, Dante. Fit in without making too much noise. That's how people get ahead." Dante rose slowly. His voice came out measured, flat. "Thank you for the advice." Wade nodded, already moving on to something else. Dante walked out, but his mind didn't. Dante didn't head back to his office right away. Instead, he walked past the glass walls, past the sterile break room, and stepped into the stairwell. Door closed behind him with a muffled thud. It was quiet there. No keyboards clacking, no half-hearted greetings. Just him, 4 concrete walls, and the rising pressure in his chest. He sank onto the cold step, one hand covering his mouth. The words repeated like a broken record. Urban trash. He had sat through years of lectures, earned 2 degrees, built a groundbreaking algorithm, and still, he was nothing more than a stereotype in the eyes of the man who signed his paychecks. He wasn't just invisible. He was unwanted. He thought of his mother, how she used to iron his shirts before job interviews, even when her own hands were sore from scrubbing floors. How she told him over and over, "Don't let them tell you who you are." How proud her voice sounded when he got the call from Blackstone. How would he explain this to her? He pulled out his phone and opened the company's press release again. Rick's name was there, bold and praised. The project, the one he had spent 3 months perfecting, now belonged to someone else. Someone who didn't care about its roots. Someone who hadn't spent time running simulations on crumbling urban road grids because he remembered ambulances getting stuck near his grandmother's block. Dante stared at the screen until his vision blurred. Then he closed it and sat in silence. Later that night, he sat in his car outside his apartment, keys still in the ignition. He hadn't even turned the radio on. The darkness around him felt heavier than usual, pressing into his chest. He should have fought back in that office. He should have said something sharper, more powerful. But the words hadn't come. They never did in the moment. Only after, when it was too late. He hated that. He hated feeling small. He hated that even now, after everything, he still questioned if he belonged. Across the street, a father walked his son down the sidewalk. The boy pointed at something in the distance, laughing. The man leaned down, listening carefully, smiling wide. That used to be Dante and his uncle Jerome, walking home from the basketball court. Back then, the world hadn't yet taught him to shrink himself. His phone buzzed, a text from Keisha. "I saw what they did. I'm sorry. You didn't deserve that." He stared at it for a moment, then typed back a simple, "Thanks." She didn't respond right away, and he didn't need her to. Just knowing someone else had seen it, that it hadn't been all in his head, was something. Small, but something. The next morning at work, Dante arrived early. He sat at his desk and opened the project files again. Not because he wanted to help Rick polish them, but because the work still mattered. The people in his old neighborhood still mattered, and as long as the system worked, someone would benefit. But this time, he began documenting everything, every idea, every change, every data point he generated. He logged it in his own files, not for recognition, for protection. He watched Wade from a distance that day. The man moved through the office like he owned oxygen, smooth, smiling, shaking hands and cracking jokes, a master of appearances. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His prejudice was laced, incivility, hidden behind quarterly goals and coded language. And that was the most dangerous kind. Dante realized something in that moment. This wasn't about one insult, one stolen credit. It was about a pattern, a system, one that rewarded compliance and punished individuality, one that saw his presence as an obligation, not a merit, one that dressed up bigotry in blazers and brushed it off with smiles. He couldn't change the system overnight, but he could prepare. He could remember. He could resist, in his own way, in his own time. For now, he would stay quiet. He would nod. He would do the work. But beneath that calm surface, he was building something far more powerful than an algorithm. He was building a case. And the man who called him urban trash would one day understand just how costly it was to underestimate the quiet ones. Dante moved through the office like a ghost. He showed up early, left late, and spoke only when spoken to. Gone was the easy smile he once carried, the quiet confidence that used to settle in his shoulders like armor. Now, his steps felt calculated. Each email he sent was reread 3 times. Each sentence in a meeting rehearsed in his head before he dared say it aloud. He had started watching himself in a way he hadn't since he was a teenager, watching not just what he did, but how he existed. His tone, his posture, even the way he laughed. Did it sound too loud, too casual, too black? One morning he overheard 2 employees near the coffee machine. "He's just intense," one whispered. "Yeah," the other said. "Bit of an attitude problem too." He didn't flinch, didn't stop, just walked by as if he hadn't heard. But the words followed him into the elevator, onto his floor, into his seat. Attitude problem, all for asking to be recognized for his own work. Rick avoided him now. He'd sit across the table in meetings and speak like Dante wasn't there, referring to his team's development, without once acknowledging who had written the very lines of code he was presenting. A few colleagues smiled at Dante when no one was looking, but none spoke up. Not when it mattered, not publicly. He'd always known the rules. Be twice as good, work twice as hard, stay twice as quiet. But even now, following those rules didn't protect him. It only made him invisible, away. His apartment was silent. He used to put on music while cooking or talk to his sister on speaker while sorting through emails. Now he left the TV off, ate in silence, slept with the blinds drawn and one eye open. Some nights he couldn't sleep at all. He'd lie in bed, replaying the moment in Wade's office again and again, the way he said it, the casual cruelty. Urban trash. It didn't even come with malice, that was the worst part. It came with a smile, like it was just a fact of life. One night, around 2 a.m., Dante sat at his kitchen table staring at his laptop. The glow of the screen was the only light in the room. His employment contract was open. He had read it before signing, but this time he read every line like it held a secret, every clause, every footnote, and there it was, buried deep in legal. Phrasing, a section labeled Employee Protections and IP Attribution. It stated clearly that any discriminatory conduct, verbal or structural, violated company policy and could nullify leadership rights to a project's IP, In the event of dispute. The words hit differently now. He leaned back in his chair, heart slowly picking up speed. Maybe they don't own everything after all. The thought sat with him through the night. He remembered being 12, riding his bike home from the store, candy bar in one pocket, change in the other. A cop car pulled up beside him, lights flashing. Siren just loud enough to make him stop. The officer asked if he stole the bike. Asked for proof. Asked why someone like him had a new backpack. He was 12. No charges, no apology. Just a warning. Stay out of trouble. He remembered being 16, getting a perfect score on his science fair project, only to hear the judge tell another parent he must have had help. As if brilliance couldn't belong to someone with braids and hand-me-down sneakers. Even in college, even when he won the Tech Incubator Challenge, the donor shook his hand and said, "You speak so well," like it was a compliment. Like he didn't expect articulation from someone who looked like Dante. All those moments had built walls inside him, quiet ones, the kind people don't see. He had painted over them with degrees and discipline. He thought he'd climbed above them. But here they were again, familiar and suffocating. He could hear his mother's voice sometimes, clear as if she were sitting beside him. "They'll try to shrink you," she used to say. "But don't forget who raised you. Don't forget what's in your blood." Her hands were rough from years of labor, but her words were always soft when they came from love. She gave him pride when the world tried to strip it away. But lately, even her voice was fading in his mind, drowned out by meetings, stolen credit, and rooms that froze every time he entered. Still, that line in the contract kept flashing back into his thoughts. Discriminatory conduct, nullification of leadership. Right, it wasn't just legal language. It was a small opening, a crack in the armor of the system that made him feel so powerless. He bookmarked the page, saved a copy, highlighted the section in yellow, just in case. Over the next few weeks, Dante functioned like a machine. He showed up, he coded, he met deadlines. But inside, something was unraveling. Each day chipped away at the version of himself he had spent years building, the man who believed that excellence could earn respect, that performance could silence prejudice. His confidence began to slip through the cracks. He caught himself changing his speech during meetings, softening his opinions, second-guessing things he used to say without hesitation. He started choosing neutral colors, skipping the sneakers he once wore proudly on casual Fridays. Every move felt like a calculation, how to appear sharp but not intimidating, how to be assertive but never aggressive, how to stay visible but never too loud. And yet it never seemed to be enough. The comments continued, subtle, always subtle. One afternoon as he passed by the break room, he heard someone say, "Well, you know how these diversity hires get when they don't feel special enough." He kept walking, but the words stuck to his skin. In the lunchroom, conversations died when he sat down. In team meetings, ideas he floated were met with silence, until someone else rephrased them and suddenly they became brilliant. People who once chatted with him in the elevator now glanced at their phones. Some shifted in their seats when he spoke, as if the air changed when he opened his mouth. Rumors floated. "He's hard to work with. He's too emotional. He has a chip on his shoulder." The most painful part wasn't the whispers. It was the silence that followed. The people who saw it happen and said nothing. The Weans who knew what was wrong but chose comfort over courage. It made Dante feel like he was losing his mind. Like maybe it was him. Maybe he was overreacting. Maybe he should just be quiet, stay in his lane, keep his head down. But every time those doubts crept in, something inside him pushed back. The memory of his mother crying when he graduated with honors. The pride in Tiana's eyes when she told her friends her brother was building smart city stuff to help people. The faces of his childhood neighbors who told him he made them believe in possibility. No, he wasn't the problem. The system was. Late one night, he visited his old neighborhood for the first time in months. The streets hadn't changed much. Streetlights still flickered, and sidewalks still cracked. But the corner store clerk remembered his name. The neighbor down the block still waved with the same warmth as when he was a kid. He walked past the basketball court where he used to shoot hoops with Jerome. The net was gone, but the court was still there, scarred but standing, just like him. He sat on the bench and let the quiet settle around him. There were no corporate hierarchies here, no suits, no smiles hiding sharp edges, just memory, just clarity. That night, back in his apartment, he opened his journal for the first time in weeks. And for hours he wrote. Not code, not project notes, but thoughts, feelings, pain, anger, truth. He wrote about what it felt like to walk into a room and feel smaller just for being present, about how it broke something in you when people smiled to your face but erased you in their actions, about how exhaustion wasn't always physical. Sometimes it came from carrying the weight of who you had to pretend to be. The next morning, something felt different, not lighter, but clearer. He walked into the office and made copies of every project draft he'd worked on, backed up his contributions to a private cloud, archived emails, meeting notes, timelines, everything. Quietly, carefully, because he wasn't just working anymore. He was preparing. He kept to himself, but this time not out of fear, out of strategy. He watched. He documented. He listened when others talked loosely in hallways, and each time Wade dropped another offhand comment, each time Rick paraded someone else's work as his own, Dante filed it all away, not in anger, but in truth. Because truth, he realized, was the most powerful thing he had left. He didn't know exactly what he was going to do with it yet, but one thing was clear now. They might own the office space, the meeting rooms, the paychecks, but they didn't own him, and they didn't own the truth. The shift began not with fire, but with a whisper. Dante was standing by the copier, late one evening, eyes bleary from back-to-back meetings when he heard someone call his name softly. He turned to find Reena Patel leaning against the wall, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. They had exchanged a few polite words over the past year. She worked down in legal, sharp as a blade, always walking fast with a phone in her hand, and tension in her shoulders. She didn't waste time with small talk, and no one really knew where she stood on anything. But now she looked at him like she had been watching for longer than he realized. "I saw the email," she said, voice low. "Rick's breakthrough. That was your model, right?" Dante hesitated. The hallway was empty, but in places like this, you learn to treat silence like surveillance. He nodded once. She stepped closer. "You're not the first." He blinked. "What do you mean?" Reena checked the hallway again, then held up a flash drive, barely larger than her thumb. "Not here," she said. "Meet me tomorrow. Lunch. Ivy and Ash, the place with the green awning. Don't bring your badge. Don't tell anyone." Then she turned and walked off, heels clicking like punctuation. The next day, they met in a quiet corner booth tucked behind the bar. Reena ordered tea. Dante didn't touch the menu. The silence between them held weight until she finally slid the flash drive across the table. 4 employees, she said. All people of color, all accused of misconduct, all left quietly, with NDAs. 2 engineers, 1 marketing director, 1 executive assistant. None of them stayed longer than 2 years. But one of them never signed. Dante's fingers curled around the drive, still unsure what to say. Reena leaned in, her voice quiet but sharp. "I know what Wade said to you. He's done it before. Sometimes worse, sometimes softer. He wraps it in words that are just vague. Enough, just polite enough. But the harm, the erasure, it's all the same." He stared at her. "Why now?" She exhaled slowly. "Because I've been waiting for someone who could stand it, who could fight it smart, not loud, not angry, strategic." She held his gaze. "And because I'm tired." That night, Dante didn't sleep. He sat in his living room with his laptop open, the flash drive blinking blue. It contained internal emails, redacted memos, and reports stamped confidential. He read through them, one by one. It was like reading echoes of his own experience. Voices that sounded like his, buried under corporate jargon and legal silence. There were notes where Wade had described a former black engineer as culturally incompatible. Another file documented a Latina executive being removed from a major campaign after she created tension with her tone. Every time the same pattern: praise at first, followed by subtle exclusion, then complaints of being too much, and finally an exit sealed with silence. Dante felt something rise in him. Not rage, not grief. Clarity. They had built a system that thrived on silence. That was the secret. Keep people tired. Keep them isolated. Make them feel like the problem. But he wasn't alone anymore. He began organizing, not in protest, but in preparation. Every meeting he attended, he logged. Every project revision, every task he submitted, every comment that carried a quiet sting, he wrote it all down. He saved email chains, screen recordings, drafts with timestamps. There were no outbursts, no confrontations, just cold, deliberate precision. Weeks passed. Rena stayed in the background, providing guidance when needed. She recommended a name: Malik Torrance. Dante met him in a diner that smelled like burnt coffee and old vinyl booths. Malik was in his early 50s with salt and pepper hair, thick-rimmed glasses, and a calm that made him seem unshakable. "I've read the documents," Malik said, sliding a folder across the table. "You've got a case, but more than that, you've got leverage." Dante opened the folder to see legal outlines and notes in red ink. "This isn't just about what they did to you," Malik continued. "This is about the pattern, the silence, the paper trail." He paused, leaning forward. "They've built this company on other people's backs, quiet ones, but yours doesn't have to be." Dante nodded slowly, absorbing every word. He walked out of that diner knowing what had to come next. Not revenge, reckoning. The days that followed felt different. Dante moved through the office with quiet purpose. The fatigue was still there. He felt it in his bones, but it no longer weighed him down. Now it sharpened him. He continued his work as if nothing had changed. He showed up on time, met every deadline, sat through every meeting. But behind every polite nod and professional email was a man building a wall of truth brick by brick. Rick remained oblivious, still flaunting his innovation in cross-team briefings. In one presentation, Dante watched as Rick explained the AI system's core logic, his logic, as if it had come to him in a dream. The same lines of code Dante had written during his sleepless nights were now being used to sell the company's vision to major investors. And then it happened. The company called a special meeting. A major merger had been finalized, one that would put Blackstone at the forefront of national smart infrastructure. The announcement came with bold headlines and a glossy pitch deck, and right there, at the center of it, was the traffic model. His model, repackaged, renamed, and presented as the crown jewel of Blackstone's future. But there was no mention of his name, no recognition, not even a footnote. That night, he stayed at the office long after the lights had dimmed. The building was quiet, save for the hum of servers and the occasional creak in the vents. He sat at his desk, staring at the merger documents saved on the shared drive. He scrolled slowly, taking screenshots, saving everything to a secure cloud folder he'd created. Weeks ago, each slide of that deck felt like a betrayal dressed in suits and sanitized fonts. The deeper he read, the clearer it became. Wade and his team were preparing for a multi-million-dollar payday, using something they had no legal right to claim, because the model, down to its original code base, was documented under Dante's name. In internal submissions, Rena had confirmed it. Malik had validated it. It was his. By erasing him, they had broken more than just moral ground. They had broken the law. The next day, Dante met Rena in the parking garage. She didn't say much. She didn't need to. She handed him a sealed envelope with the final draft of the legal filing. Inside was the official notice, an intent to sue for racial discrimination, intellectual property theft, and violation of internal corporate policy. Malik had gone over every line. It was airtight. Dante stood there for a moment, envelope in hand, Heart thudding not with fear, but with power. "I'm really doing this," he said under his breath. Rena looked at him. "You already did." Later that evening, he watched from the corner of the office as Wade walked by, still laughing with another executive, still untouched by the rot he spread through smiles and strategy. Dante didn't say a word. He didn't have to. Because by the end of the week, everything would change. The silence they had fed on for years was about to end. And for once, it wouldn't be his voice making the noise. It would be theirs, rattling with the realization that the man they tried to ignore had built the very system they now depended on, and he was no longer playing by their rules. It began with a letter. Crisp white envelope, hand-delivered to the boardroom just minutes before the weekly leadership meeting. Wade Hargrove barely looked up from his phone as the assistant placed it in front of him. His fingers paused for a second, eyes scanning. The return address. Then he slid it aside without opening it, more annoyed than concerned. But the contents of that envelope would change everything. Across town, Dante sat in Malik's office, a modest space with more law books than furniture and windows that rattled when buses passed. There was no ceremony, no fanfare. Just a quiet readiness, a silence that held meaning. "It's out," Malik said, setting his phone on the table. Dante nodded once. No smile, just stillness. The legal complaint was clear and direct. It alleged racial discrimination, intellectual property theft, and breach of contract. Attached were over 60 exhibits, emails, code repositories, performance evaluations, audio recordings from meetings and internal memos. Every detail, every moment he had endured, had been carefully collected and laid bare. But that wasn't the only thing that dropped. At exactly 9:03 a.m., a major news outlet released an article, headlined, "Whistleblower Exposes Pattern of Racial Bias at Tech Giant Blackstone." The article told the story of Employee X, a brilliant software engineer who had watched his work stolen, his voice dismissed, and his presence quietly erased. It included testimony from other past employees, voices long silenced, now woven into a narrative too loud to ignore. Screenshots of internal messages, a timeline of exits, even phrases like urban trash cited from first-hand accounts. Rena had made sure every quote was corroborated. Every source protected. Social media exploded. Hashtags spread like wildfire. Black engineers matter. Shark code stolen. Speak Dante speak by noon. The stock had begun to slide. Emails within the company leaked. Executives scrambling to contain the situation. PR teams spinning words into apologies before legal advised them to say nothing at all. In the boardroom, the air had turned ice cold. Wade, still processing the morning's events, finally opened the envelope. His hands shook slightly as he read. Not because of guilt, but because for the first time his power was being questioned. And it wasn't behind closed doors. It was public, national, legal. The letter included a list of violations with exact dates, direct quotes, and IP attribution logs. It showed beyond dispute that Dante had authored over 94% of the AI model powering Blackstone's next big product. Timestamps, Git commits, submission receipts, all aligned. One section of the evidence listed Wade's email to a fellow executive, referring to Dante as just optics. Another quoted him instructing a team to remove Dante's name from a client-facing document to keep branding clean. There was no defense, just exposure, and it was spreading. By late afternoon, media vans lined up outside Blackstone's headquarters. Journalists waited at the doors, cameras rolling as employees walked in and out, their faces filled with confusion and worry. Some glanced down, others whispered into phones. The company they had once believed was progressive, inclusive, a symbol of modern success, was unraveling in real time. Inside, HR called an emergency meeting. By 4 p.m., Wade was placed on administrative leave effective immediately. He didn't protest. He didn't slam fists or raise his voice. He just stood in silence, the same silence he had once used like a weapon. Dante watched from across the street. He didn't walk in. He didn't speak to reporters. He didn't need to. He stood under the shade of a tree, watching the building that had tried to swallow him now turn in on itself. For so long he had tried to fit in, tried to be what they expected, tried to stay polite, quiet, professional. But none of it had protected him. Not really. What had protected him, what had saved him was truth. And courage. Not the kind that comes with speeches or stages. The kind that comes when you stand alone in the dark and decide to keep going anyway. A young black employee stepped out of the building. She saw him and paused, gave a slight nod. That was all. But in that moment, Dante understood what it meant. He had broken the silence not just for himself, but for everyone who came after. He looked up at the building once more, the windows reflecting the chaos inside. And for the first time, he didn't feel small. He felt whole. By the next morning, Dante's inbox was flooded, not with company notices or internal chatter, but messages from strangers. Some were from engineers who had walked away from tech years ago, burned by the same silence he had fought through. Others were from students, dreamers, parents, people who had followed the story and seen themselves in it. One message read, "I thought I was crazy for feeling how I did. You made me feel sane again." Another simply said, "Thank you for standing up. Thank you for not shrinking." He didn't reply to most. He couldn't. The weight of it was overwhelming. But he read every word. Rena called that afternoon. Her voice carried the sharpness of someone used to stress. But now there was something softer beneath it. Relief, maybe. Or vindication. "They're trying to reach you," she said. "Wade's out. The board wants to meet. Quietly." Dante didn't answer right away. He sat in his apartment looking out the window. The sun was slipping low, casting a golden hue across the city. The same city that once told him he didn't belong in certain rooms. The same skyline that loomed over his childhood like a distant promise. "They didn't listen when you spoke in their meetings," Rena added. "Now they'll have to listen under oath." He nodded. "Let's move forward." 2 days later, the headlines changed again. "Lead engineer of disputed AI model breaks silence. They took my voice. I took their silence." The quote echoed across platforms. It wasn't a roar. It wasn't a threat. It was calm, steady, unshaken. The world had expected anger, bitterness. But what they got instead was truth delivered with dignity. In private mediation, Dante laid everything on the table. He didn't beg. He didn't accuse. He simply presented the facts, the data trails, the words that were spoken to him, the emails they thought he'd never see again. He told them how he sat in his car after being called urban trash, wondering if he'd ever be enough, how he had started to believe their silence meant something was wrong with him, how he documented every meeting because he knew one day someone would try to erase him again. And then he told them what it meant to finally see that erasure exposed. One executive tried to apologize. Another called it a misunderstanding that got out of hand. But Dante didn't engage. He wasn't there for closure. He was there for correction. And correction came, not just in financial compensation, not just in an amended public statement, but in structural change, mandatory internal audits, a third-party equity consultant, and the creation of a new program designed by Dante to ensure employees from underrepresented backgrounds had legal and intellectual ownership rights clearly protected. He didn't ask to return to Blackstone. He had already outgrown the building long before they tried to bury his name. On the day the settlement became public, reporters swarmed the company's headquarters. Cameras flashed, voices called his name. But Dante didn't step forward for a speech. He stood across the street again, quietly watching, a calm expression on his face. Not smug, not triumphant, just free. Behind those windows were the same people who once couldn't look him in the eye, the same polished halls that once swallowed his voice. Now, those halls echoed with questions, accountability, change, and his name. Not whispered, not hidden, spoken clear. Rena joined him a few minutes later. She handed him a small envelope, a thank you note from a young intern in the legal department. She said she's staying because of you, Rena said. She almost walked away from all of this, but now she wants to become a civil rights attorney. Dante smiled faintly. They stood together in silence. Then he turned to her. They thought, they ended my story when they stole my credit, he said quietly. But that was just the prologue. The settlement was headline news for 3 days. Industry analysts called it a landmark moment. Pundits debated its impact on diversity in tech. But Dante stayed quiet, not because he didn't have something to say, but because he knew what mattered most couldn't be captured in headlines. He had accepted the compensation, not because money could undo what had been done, but because he had plans far bigger than himself. What truly mattered came weeks later, when a small ribbon-cutting ceremony was held in the heart of the same neighborhood where he'd once dodged potholes on a rusted bike. The community center had been abandoned for years, its windows cracked, its walls tagged, its roof bowed with time. But today, the building stood tall, windows gleaming, walls painted in bright, welcoming colors. The new sign read, Urban Genius, a tech incubator for future creators. Inside, kids as young as 10 sat behind sleek laptops, eyes wide with curiosity. As they followed beginner coding tutorials, teens sketched app ideas on whiteboards, laughing and bouncing ideas off each other. On one wall, a mural depicted a young boy reaching out to touch the sky, binary code trailing from his fingers like stardust. This wasn't a revenge story. It was a renewal. Dante walked through the space with quiet pride. He watched a girl in a purple hoodie troubleshoot her first game algorithm. A boy showed off his custom-built circuit. The room buzzed with energy, potential no one could ignore. Rena had joined him not as a lawyer, but as a board member. She didn't want titles. She wanted purpose. She had seen too much silence in her career. Now she was determined to help raise voices. Malik had agreed to host monthly workshops, teaching high schoolers how to understand their rights, how to speak their truth, how to build power from knowledge. He called it Justice 101, and he joked that it was the first class that made the legal system feel like armor instead of a cage. They were building something bigger than a program. They were building a future. And Dante, he was finally breathing freely. The real win hadn't been bringing a company to its knees. It had been standing tall on his own terms, reclaiming the ground he once thought he had to shrink himself to survive on. Later that fall, he was invited to speak at his former high school. The gymnasium still smelled of old sweat and waxed floors. The bleachers creaked the same way, but the faces were new, young, eager, uncertain. He looked out at them and took a long pause before he spoke. I'm not here to talk about success, he began. I'm here to talk about silence, about what it means when you stop believing in your own voice because the world keeps trying to erase it. He spoke of the boardroom where no one clapped, the comment that felt like a knife, the nights he questioned everything. And then he spoke of the moment he decided not to stay small. I didn't win because I shouted the loudest, he said. I won because I didn't walk away from myself. The auditorium was still when he finished. Then came a single clap, then another, and then a wave of applause that didn't stop. For a full minute. That evening, as the sun dipped below the rooftops and the streetlights flickered on, Dante walked back through the doors of Urban Genius. The center was quieter now. Most of the kids had gone home. But the hum of progress still lingered. Machines left running, a half-finished robot on a desk, sticky notes lining the wall like colorful dreams waiting their turn. He stepped into the main room and looked around. Every inch of that space felt like a memory reclaimed, a future rewritten. Laughter echoed from the back. A small group of teens was still gathered around one laptop, troubleshooting code together. One of them turned and waved. He waved back, his chest warm with something deeper than pride. At the far end of the room, mounted on the wall above the main workspace, was a large wooden frame. Inside it, printed in bold, elegant letters, was a quote. Your name is not trash. It's the seed of a story they tried to bury but didn't know would grow. It wasn't signed. It didn't have to be. The people in this building knew where it came from. Dante stood in the glow of the overhead lights, surrounded by the future he had helped plant, not by fighting for a seat at their table, but by building his own. This was never just about justice. It was about legacy, about making sure the next generation wouldn't have to fight the same invisible battles just to be seen. As he turned off the lights and stepped outside into the calm night, he smiled quietly to himself. For the first time in a long time, he felt at peace, because they had tried to silence him, and instead, they made him unforgettable.